The build modifier allows us to create an animation which either builds or destroys the geometry of our model across a certain length of time. For example, we have in the timeline below 250 frames, and we can use the build modifier to either construct or destroy the geometry of our selected model over that period. To access the build modifier, go to the Modifiers tab in the Properties panel. Select the Add Modifier button, go to Generate, and then select Build from this list. You will now have added the build modifier to your object. Initially, it looks as though the build modifier has completely destroyed the geometry of the model, but watch what happens when I press play. Very quickly, the geometry of the cube begins to appear until we reach approximately frame 100, which is the length defined here in the Modifiers tab. It should be noted that this modifier will work much better with objects that have a lot of geometry. So I'm going to replace the cube object now with one that has a little bit more geometry to work with, such as the monkey object. Now we're going to add our build modifier, and again, by default, all of the geometry is going to disappear from our mesh. But if we press the plus button to play the animation, you will see the construction of our model's geometry over a set period of time. One of the main use cases of the build modifier is to construct your model up to a certain point and then apply the modifier. When you apply the modifier at a certain point, any geometry that had not been constructed will have been deleted. So as an example, let's move to around frame 59. So we effectively have the face area of Suzanne visible. And let's say this is the only area that I wanted to use. All I would need to do now is just go to the menu here and then select Apply. As soon as I apply the build modifier, and then I manipulate my timeline, you will see that the geometry no longer appears or disappears. The modifier no longer affects the model, so we are left with the geometry that you see at that specific point. Let's turn our attention to the parameters used within the build modifier. Again, I'm going to add the build modifier to Suzanne, and whenever we do that, we will first of all see that all of the geometry has been removed. Now at the moment, I'm on frame 1 in my timeline, and as we've already learned, when I press play, the build modifier is going to construct the geometry of the model. The first parameter we have here is the start frame for the build modifier to take effect. If I set this to frame 30, for example, it's going to begin the process on the 30th frame. So if I just scroll or scrub through the timeline between frames 0 and 30, no geometry is added within the 3D viewport. It is only after frame 30 that the build modifier begins to construct our geometry. So let's say I wanted to start at frame 120. I can come back to the build modifier, type in 120, and now if I scrub through my timeline for the first 120 frames, the build modifier does not take effect. But if I move past frame 120, then the geometry starts to gradually appear. Now below that we have the length. This is the time it's going to take for the build process to go from start to finish. In this example, we're starting on frame 120 and have a length of 100 frames. This means that Suzanne should be complete by frame 220. So if we go back to the start and press the play button, Nothing will happen for the first 120 frames, and then the geometry begins to form and is completed on frame 220. So here we can combine when to start the process of the build modifier and how long it's going to last. Underneath the length parameter, we have a checkbox that is labeled reversed. This, as the tooltip describes, will deconstruct the mesh instead of build it. So we can left click here, and as soon as we do that, all of our geometry shows up on our model. Again, keep in mind, we're starting on frame 120 with a length of 100 frames. If I press play, we're going to maintain the entirety of our model until frame 120, when the geometry gradually begins to disappear. If I want to speed up the process, I can reduce the length of the build animation. So let's say I reduce this down to 50 frames. Then it's going to start at frame 120 and it's going to finish at frame 170. We still have the reversed checkbox applied. So if I just press play, we're going to give it a few seconds to reach frame 120, and then you should see the build modifier works a lot quicker. If you really want it to work fast, we could set it to something like 20 frames. Let's change the start frame to 60 and then press play. And after 60 seconds, the build modifier operates very quickly on the model. But again, it's doing so with the reversed checkbox applied. Underneath that, we have the Randomize option. Now we can open up this menu to change the seed, but before we do that, we're just going to see what happens if we tick the Randomize option here, and then we're going to press play. But to best demonstrate this, I'm going to increase the length to 120 frames. So I'll press play, and then after 60 frames, you'll see that we begin to deconstruct the model, but you will also see that it's being randomized in terms of which geometry is going to be removed. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this start frame back to 1. To make it easy to see, I'm going to increase the length to 200 frames, and I'm going to turn off reversed and turn randomize off as well, and press play. So here we start with the eyes, we move on to the face, and then once the face is completed, we do the head and finish with the ears. However, if I'm to randomize this and press the play button, you can see that geometry is being created all over the mesh in a very randomized pattern. Now we can change this pattern by changing the seed value. So currently it's set to 0. The number here doesn't really mean too much. All you need to know is that every time you change the seed, you're changing the order in which the faces are going to be constructed on your model. So, for example, just pay a little bit close attention to the seed value, which is currently set to 1 for the randomize, and just take a look at which of our faces are being constructed. And then if we change that seed and play again, it's probably difficult to spot with objects that have a lot of geometry, but you should be able to see that the faces that are being added are different to the ones that they were before in terms of the order. Perhaps a better way to demonstrate the seed option is with an object that has less geometry. So I'm just going to replace this with a cube object. I'm going to add the build modifier and set it to randomize. Let's set the seed to 1. And if I press play after setting this to 250 frames, just so it goes nice and slow, we'll press play. And gradually the geometry is going to be added to our cube bit by bit. So here in this example, we basically created the outside of the cube and then the 2 endpoints. Let's try changing to a different seed and press play again. And now you can see the geometry that is being generated, the faces that are selected for creation. It's a slightly different order because we've managed to change the seed value here. It is also possible to combine the build modifier with other modifiers to create more detailed effects for your model. For example, we can add a subdivision surface modifier to increase the amount of geometry. We would need to first of all position the subdivision surface modifier above the build modifier. Then when we press play, you would actually find that the build modifier still operates correctly, despite the fact that we have added more geometry using a different modifier. If I increase the number of levels in the viewport and press play, it is still working correctly, dissolving that geometry over time. Note that this effect is going to be different if you position the subdivision surface below. If you position it below the build modifier, then the build modifier is actually going to deconstruct based on the original geometry, which means depending on the length or speed of the modifier, you may notice that groups of faces are being dissolved instead of singular ones each time. Despite the fact that we have a good understanding of all the parameters of the build modifier, we still don't quite know how to change the order of the build modifier and the way it constructs our geometry beyond just randomizing it. If I press the play button each time, it's always going to start with the eyes for Suzanne, then the face, then the head, then the ears. But let's say I wanted to start with the ears first. Let's say I wanted to reverse this order. Well, I can do that by going into edit mode for my object, and while in edit mode I'm going to see all of my model. Then I'm going to go to mesh, come down to where it says sort elements, and we have a variety of options for how we can determine which elements are going to be prioritized first and how. So in this case, I'm going to set this to reverse. I'm also in the operator panel here, I'm going to set this to faces because this will give us the best result. And then I'm going to go back to frame 1 and back into object mode. Now I'm going to press play. Remember, initially we were using the build modifier and it was constructing the eyes, then the face, then the head, then the ears. If I press the play button now, we construct the ears, the head, the face, and then the eyes. So we have reversed the order of the build modifier. Another way to use the build modifier is to separate our geometry however we require. Now in Blender we have access to the separate tool, which would allow us to separate by selection, loose parts, material, etc. We can also use the build modifier to kind of achieve this, and it actually works pretty well if you have a very geometrically dense model that's going to be quite difficult to actually select the areas that you want to separate. So in this example, it looks like we have one Suzanne object, but we actually have two. So I can hide one Suzanne object and then the head disappears, or I can hide the second Suzanne and the face disappears. I've achieved this by adding the build modifier to both Suzannes, setting the length to 100, setting the frame to 51 just after the halfway point, and also by reversing the elements for one of the two objects. So this leaves me with Suzanne as a whole, but only when we combine both of our models. From here, I can apply the modifier on each of these objects, and I can then select both of them, hit Ctrl J to join, and then press the Tab key. Now I've got two parts of the mesh, which I can select with the L key. So I can select the back with the L key, or I can select the front, which is the face. Now, depending on your model, it may just be quicker to select the geometry and then use the separate tool. But for objects that have more geometry and are more difficult to select, then using the build modifier in this way may be helpful to you. Another modifier that works very well with the build modifier is the array. In this example, we've created a single cube, or as we should rename it, brick. And we've used the array modifier 3 times to create a brick wall. So the first array is actually used to create the bottom row of bricks. The second array is used to create the row just above. So this is the second row. And then the third array in this example is used to add instances of the first and second rows as a group each time. So if I set this down to 1, we have the first 2 rows of the brick wall. And with each count, we can increase the total number of rows and therefore the total height of our brick wall. We can combine this with the build modifier. So we can go add, generate, and then select build. Again, by default, it's going to disappear because we have it set to the default options. But if I press the play button, you will see that we are generating our brick wall 1 brick at a time. So let's increase the length value to around 240. Press play, and you can see how each individual brick is added. So in this example, we're not necessarily building the individual faces. Instead, we're using the build modifier to add the individual bricks that are created with the 3 arrays directly above it. One thing to note though, when using the array modifier before the build modifier, is that the only geometry that you are effectively working with is that of the original mesh. So if I was to attempt to sort elements by going to mesh, sort elements, and then let's go reverse and set that to faces. Let's try it moving back to the start and then pressing play. You can see that the constructed geometry is slightly different in terms of how it's generating each brick, but this isn't really what we would be looking for in terms of trying to randomize which bricks are going to be created. This is a result, of course, of the fact that we are still only using the data from the original brick. So what we would need to do here is apply each of the arrays, and then we would need to change the element that we are using for this selection. So again, we're going to go into edit mode, mesh, sort elements, and for example, let's go reverse faces. And because we've done that once already, we can actually see here that we have started from the opposite end of our model. So each of these bricks is now being generated in the opposite order to what it was before. Alternatively, again, we can go back and we can choose a different option. For example, we can go randomize, faces, choose a seed, come back into object mode, and press play, and that will randomize the geometry that is created. Of course, now it's just randomizing the individual faces rather than the blocks, so that's just something to keep in mind when using the build modifier in this way. Another thing I want to point out here with regards to sorting elements is that you can also sort the elements by selection, material, your view on the x-axis, your view on the c-axis, or cursor distance. Cursor distance is actually quite a popular one. So let's say I wanted to actually begin generating my geometry from this area here. I'm going to select my 3D cursor, And then perhaps if we just enable snapping and snap to vertex, and I'm just going to snap to this vertex right here. Then we're going to turn off snapping, go back to our usual selection method, go mesh, sort elements, cursor distance. Make sure to select faces because that's what the build modifier works with. Go back into object mode and press play. Now the geometry is being generated one brick at a time based on its distance from the 3D cursor's position. So that's all for now on how to use the build modifier in Blender, and also how to combine it with other modifiers such as subdivision surface and the array modifier to create really interesting effects using animation. I hope you've found this tutorial helpful. Keep an eye out for more in the coming days and weeks, as we will be covering many of the different modifiers used to generate geometry within Blender. That's all from me for now, and I'll see you in the next video.